but I think some of them are deeply involved in the occult.
What is a good definition of money that so everybody's on the same page?
The definition of money, well, that's uh, that's pretty easy actually, because I think most of the dictionaries agree that I mean, there are all kinds of money, but the basic definition is that it's a medium of exchange. In other words, it's something that you can't use directly, but you accept it anyway because you can always pass it on to somebody else and get what you want. So it's a medium of exchange as opposed to barter. So that's the accepted definition of it.
So basically, as long as me and you agree to that this thing is worth something and that I want to exchange what you have, let's say a book in your shelf for maybe a couple pens, that would be considered money, the pens.
Yeah, as long as we agree. Of course, we wouldn't do it if we didn't agree, unless we were forced to by legal tender laws or something like that, forced to
hmm
accept a type of money that we don't really want, but we have no choice. Yeah, that's it. It's pretty simple. Mhm.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned, bartering, is that considered like in human history, that's the first type of money that people would do, like exchange one?
Well, most academics who deal with this classify barter not as money, but as pre-money. Barter is barter.
Mm.
It's I give you my horse for your donkey, or that's it. And but when you get to money, then you have this medium of exchange. So you've got not only what you're paying and what you're getting, but the medium that goes in the middle. So barter is not generally considered as money.
hmm Okay. So, so to go back to money, initially people, I read your book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, and pretty much it goes over the history of money. It starts with coins. So initially people use coins, and that's something tangible. That's something that me and you could see that's worth something. You said silver, gold, things like that. So what changed to where people started using paper and saying that, well, I guess that goes into the history of banks. So how does that start?
Yeah, that is the history of banking, all right. It didn't happen overnight. It took hundreds of years, probably thousands of years, but it happened. It's sort of a natural progression, I think. But yeah, basically, going back to our definition of what money is, a medium of exchange, it has to have a quality, and that is that people will accept it. Well, people will accept a medium of exchange only if they are reasonably certain that somebody else will accept it too. So once they accept it, they'll be able to pass it on to somebody else. So whatever it has to have some kind of a universal appeal. Well, in the beginning of all of this, the only universal appeal was that this substance, whatever it was, that was to be used as money, had to have some kind of value, intrinsic value for itself, even though it wasn't used as money. And so in the beginning, the most common forms of primitive money were food. I mean, I think some of the earliest written records chiseled in stone, found in the ancient ruins of ancient civilizations, were records of jars of wheat. So many jars of wheat were stored and in the name of somebody who possessed them. And then you could swap the jars of wheat for maybe 4 jars of wheat for a cow or something like that. But everybody was willing, almost everybody was willing to accept the jars of wheat because you could eat the darn stuff and make bread out of it and all that sort of thing. So it was a logical candidate for becoming one of the earliest forms of money. And the next progression was other kinds of food. And cattle became a form of money. Everybody could have cows in their pasture, and they might not need all those cows for steak or hamburger, but or even milk. But they always had a few extra cows because they could swap them for something else. In fact, the word pecunia which is in our English language as a definition of a monetary transaction, a pecuniary transaction. The word pecunia comes from the Latin cow. So it's kind of a reminder of how this all started. So in the beginning, money was always something that had some kind of intrinsic value. I say always, perhaps I should be more cautious. There were a couple of exceptions, I think, very minor exceptions, but they were nevertheless exceptions. People in some of the South Sea islands, I understood, would accept unusual shells as money, mainly because they were unusual and they were pretty, and it was something that you wanted to possess and show off to your friends, I suppose. But it had no intrinsic value. A shell has no intrinsic value unless you want to use it as a scoop or something, like a shovel. But with that minor exception, everything I have ever heard of that was used historically as money had an intrinsic value of some kind. And of course, it didn't take long before that most common intrinsic value was metal. And the logic behind that is that metal was very essential for tools. And the most important tool was a weapon, because you would need a sword or a shield, not only to defend yourself against somebody who wanted to take your life or your property, but if you were so inclined to want to take somebody else's life or property, you had to have those same tools. So there was a lot of demand for metal in the beginning, and that was, I guess, they sort of talk about the Iron Age when that came to pass, and then the Bronze Age and so forth, as they learned how to refine metals. And then finally, when they were able to mix it with different kinds of metals and make steel, very hard metal, it was very good for shields and swords and daggers and things like that. And so ingots or little blocks of steel or iron or copper became very useful. Everybody, if you had a bunch of copper or steel in little squares, you were in pretty good shape, because a lot of people would give you food or shelter or provide services or something else in return for that. And then as long as they had a blacksmith that they could take it to, and they would hammer it into a useful weapon. So that's how it happened. And finally, the end of that process was precious metals like silver and gold. And they were primarily valuable because of their usefulness in jewelry and decorations, and also as a sign of wealth, because only the very wealthy people could afford anything made out of gold or silver, because it was so, in those days at least, it was very scarce and very hard to mine and refine. So that's all history, and it's a fascinating history, but when you think about it, it's logical. There's nothing illogical about that. And in fact, all societies around the world, the major ones, eventually wound up using gold and silver as the money base, because it had intrinsic value. It had a lot of other qualities. It never rotted. It didn't melt or go away. It didn't rust. Silver tends to rust a little bit, which is one of the reasons that gold is more valuable than silver, and all of those things. So gold and silver generally wound up historically being the ideal money for the purposes of the time, because they could be melted into small units. They could be tested for purity. Any 1 ounce gold piece, 0.999% pure, was equal in value to any other 1 ounce gold piece, 0.999% pure, and so forth. And you could melt it down and make 2 half-ounce coins, or you could melt them and put them all together and make a 2 ounce coin, and you didn't lose value by tinkering with it. So they became very, very valuable as money. Now,
this show is supported by the generous support of viewers like you. Consider donating to the cause. Link in the description.
That's what I would call, in my book, I didn't know how to identify it, so I just gave it a name. I called it commodity money. for obvious reasons, because it was basically a commodity first. And then, but now you raised the question of paper money. Now, how did that come about? Who wants paper? Because paper, it can be lost, it can be torn, it can be burned.
Counterfeited.
Yeah, counterfeited. Who in the heck wants paper money? Well, a lot of people want paper money if they can have faith that the paper is good in terms of what it is offered to be good for. In other words, it came about in the beginning when people had these little ingots of gold and silver, and they had to guard them, of course. If it was known that you were a wealthy person, and maybe you had a lot of cattle and you were involved in commerce, a lot of crooks would say, wow, this guy's got to have gold and silver someplace. We're going to just raid his place and torture him or whatever we have to do to find out where he keeps all of his gold and silver. So it was always a problem historically to guard this wealth. So it turns out that the goldsmiths or the jewelers always were known to have gold and silver on hand because that was their business. But it was also known that they had guards. They had security forces, and they patrolled their places at night. And it was really a real operation of security. And it wasn't easy to rob these people. So those who were not in the jewelry business, who had gold and silver, went to the jewelers and they said, look, we'll pay you a service fee if you will take our gold bars or our coins and guard them for us. Would you be willing to do that? And of course, sure, that was a business. They'd be happy to. I mean, they got the guards anyway in the vaults. Why not just put somebody else's gold and silver in there and collect a fee for guarding them? So that's how banking actually started. And when a person put, let's say, 5 ounces of gold into the jeweler's vault or gave it to him to guard, the jeweler would give him a receipt. So this, a piece of paper, or maybe it was not paper, but a bark from a tree, or a piece of leather, or something that you could write on, and would say, this piece of paper signifies that the holder of it is entitled to, let's say, 1 ounce of gold, 999% pure. And well, if that piece of paper came from a person or a jeweler or somebody who was well known in the community that had a good reputation for being honest, well, then that piece of paper became as good as gold because it was backed by gold. If you had the piece of paper and it was in your possession, you could take it to the jeweler and you could say, okay, it says that you're holding an ounce of gold in return for this piece of paper. Here's the paper, give me the ounce of gold. And they would do that because that was a contract in a written form. But it was written on, let's just say, paper. Eventually, it was always paper. So that's how paper money came about. It's just a receipt. That's all it is. And it's supposed to be good until you want to turn the receipt in and get your gold back. So that's how paper money started. Not a bad arrangement, providing you still have to guard your paper money, of course. Crooks will say, well, you may not have gold or silver, but he's got probably a lot of receipts hidden somewhere. So there's always that problem. But at least if you were traveling, a lot of gold or silver is pretty heavy and bulky, easier to travel with paper receipts or currency. And so, again, it's just logical. That's how it came to pass. And the receipt money is the next category, is perfectly good money if it's being used by honest people. If they issue you a receipt, well, that's what they're going to keep that gold for you. And when you turn the receipt in, by golly, there's the gold, and they hand it back to you. But you pay a fee for that. So that was the beginning of banking, and there was nothing wrong with it, honest banking. But then finally the stage came. It's hard to describe. I call that the fiat money. It's paper money, generally paper money, and it's backed by gold and silver. But the promise that is written on the paper money or implied is a lie. And I think it came about something like this. In the beginning, the jeweler's got all this gold sitting there in the vault, and his oldest son says, "Dad, we've got all this gold sitting here, and of course it doesn't belong. All of it belonged to us, and we loan gold out at interest. We can collect interest on gold if we loan it out. Now these people gave it to us to keep for them, but they never come and pick it up. They just move those paper certificates around, those receipts, and the gold just stays here. Why don't we just loan this gold out, and we can collect interest on other people's gold?" And the dad probably said, "Oh, we can't do that because that would be unethical." And the son probably said, "But Dad, look, they don't come and pick up the gold. It's just sitting there. It's useless." Dad says, "No." All right. So the dad finally dies, and the older son now takes over the business. Now, 30 years have passed, and first thing you know, they're loaning out some of the gold, even though it's promised to be held in deposit or a reserve for them, but they're loaning it out at interest because it's profitable. Well, it works okay because usually no more than 10% of the depositors want their gold or silver back at any one time. So theoretically, you could loan out 90%, and certainly if you did only 80%, you'd be very, very safe. And so that's how fractional reserve banking came into being. It was dishonest banking because the depositor was of the impression that his gold and silver was always being stored safely. Well, at the end of that process, of course, we come up to the present time when gold and silver used to be a backing of our currency, but they kept nibbling on that fraction. Well, we'll keep 80% of it and loan out 20%, and then 10 years later, well, we'll keep 70% and loan out 30%. And then 20 years later, we'll keep 50%. So it finally wound up, we keep 0% and loan it all out. In fact, we even make more on top of that just by accounting. So it was an evolutionary process, and I probably took too long to explain it, but it is a very good process as long as everybody is honest. But when you get this temptation of making easy money on somebody else's money, and they wouldn't even know you were doing it, and you might get away with it, it's something about human nature that takes over, and it always corrupts. And so all monetary systems that are based on fractional reserve banking are corrupt. In time, they become corrupted. Ours is probably the most corrupt in all history at the moment. Other nations that have done fractional reserve banking have collapsed, economically collapsed, once they got to the point of about, I would say, 40% reserves. Now we're at 0% reserves and have been for a long time. So why haven't we collapsed? Well, it's because we have a very powerful army. And anytime some nation says, well, we're not going to deal with US dollars anymore because it's funny money, it's not real money anymore. Well, then suddenly they're declared as a nation that's harboring terrorists or something, and they get invaded and their leaders get killed. So therefore, our money continues to stay because it's always backed by a very strong military force. This is a horrible situation, and it's spelling the end of the American Republic. We're beginning to see I think the beginning of the end right now. And I hope everybody that's hearing this program understands that I tell this story that I just did with no amount of glee at all. It's a very sad story to tell because I love America, and I hate to see.
If you like that clip, please find the full link to the interview below.
And
also, do not forget to subscribe to this channel to keep up with discussions of God, morality, and human freedom.